you very much, Malabika. First of all, good morning to the speaker and also some of the participants who have connected from the other part of the globe. And good evening to all my dear participants here from India and other this part of the globe, and also our student volunteers, colleagues who have been phenomenal in organizing several such events. Mainly in virtual mode once the pandemic hit us last year around March, when India started going in lockdown. We took several initiatives, and some of the events have been really praiseworthy. We have received applause and attention from global mass across the whole spectrum of the audience, for the students, from research scholars, for scientists. We have done a series of events, and that have been some of those events, as you have seen in the presentation, have been appeared in IEEE MTT-S magazine and IEEE Antennas and Propagation magazine. Coming back to APS and MTT-S Kerala chapter, we are not a very old chapter. Truly speaking, we are still in nascent stage, because APS Kerala started its journey in 2014, and MTT-S Kerala, we initiated just in 2019, just a couple of years before, thanks to motivation of some of our senior professors, some of the people whom I have worked with earlier. One of them is definitely Professor Siddiqui, who is present over here. And in 2014, when we started APS Kerala, with initiative from a group of Cochin University of Science and Technology, Professor Mohan and Professor Anandan, and we really got a lot of support from the society in several of our events. As you know, Antenna Propagation Symposium is one of the most focused AP conference which is happening since '86 in India. So we have been blessed with support from society leaders, president like Professor Sarkar, Professor Salazar, and even Professor Antar of late. We have been really blessed with various type of events. And last year, when the entire India and probably the globe, kind of got halted, we thought at least we can't do much of COVID initiative like the frontline workers, but we can definitely do something for, as an academic initiative. With this motto, we started some events in virtually, and then different part of the India also, started doing similar kind of activities. So today's event, in fact, in between, we are kind of relaxed. We thought we have, won the battle of COVID pandemic, but it has again come back as a second mode, or maybe higher order mode. It will come again, but we have to be cautious, and we have to keep the academic initiative on. That's what probably we can do to combat this unprecedented situation. So, and because of such activities, our effort have probably, I believe so, have been really meaningful to the students, because we have done several kind of events for UG students, some panel discussions on the research and, directions, etc. And then we had, some quiz contest, etc. also, just keep the students engaged in different kind of ways possible. And also we did some, internship initiative and guidance initiative for some of the UG students, which is possible to do, in the remote condition also, in virtual condition also, because this pandemic has, really made us more strong, I would say, because, the new normal has taught us how to teach and how to collaborate, how to discuss even in this virtual situation. So I'm really glad that we initiated a new unique event, which is L4, Learn from Leaders and Learn from Legends. And this L4 initiative was basically from a point of view that we need to have a kind of talks where the renowned speakers, the seasoned speakers who have spent a significant amount of time in their academic and research endeavor, if they talk to the community, especially the young community, youngsters, that would make a more sense, in a way like they can give real guidance, they can tell about their story, their success story, the tips, etc. And I am more than confident that today's speaker, Professor Iyer, is definitely, he's probably pretty, not that senior in terms of age, but he's more than senior and more than accomplished in terms of the work. I had the privilege to talk to him in several occasions, in the professional podium as well as in the other podium. We have met several times in different part of the world. I remember we had a very nice trip in Kolkata, and then I have been trying to have him here for several years, but probably next year when the pandemic is fully died off, fully attenuated, we'll try to have him here. So, because of our initiative, etc., we have received Best Chapter Award from the Antenna Propagation Society, and we are, also in a proper track to receive similar kind of accolades from the Microwave Theory and Technique Society. All of this has been possible because of our, volunteers, proper student support. I'm not taking name but there is enormous support from Professor Anu Muhammad, Orijit Mitro, and my colleague around this part of the India, Dr. Devdeep Sarkar, Professor Siddiqui, Dr. Poddar has been phenomenal. They have supported us immensely. So I don't take much time now because all of you are eagerly waiting to hear Professor Iyer, and we are really happy to declare this talk as a distinguished talk and also a LFO talk. I'm more than sure that you'll enjoy the talk academically. You'll get a lot of new research directions, a lot of impetus and thought from his talk, because I know intensely how phenomenal his research journey has been, and his contribution on transmission line metamaterial has been phenomenal, that you can see from his work, from his Google citation. Probably one talk might not be enough, but some of the people will definitely go and see his work in an intense fashion. I just very happy to mention that we have some kind of collaboration with him also, and a couple of my students have collaborated with Professor Iyer. He's a very fantastic guide, a fantastic speaker, a fantastic teacher also, that you can see from his accolades when session chair will be introducing him. Thank you very much. With this, I conclude my talk, and I, like all of you, I am also eagerly looking forward to hear the talk. Thank you. Over to you, Malabika.
Thank you, sir. So now I would like to invite Dr. Opran, President R&D, Nest Group Technopark Trivandrum, for his words.
Can you check whether Dr. Opran is present in the participation list? Dr. Opran? Dr. Opran, can you speak?
I think he is not there. We can give his speech after the talk, I guess.
Of the event. Hello, volunteers, please proceed.
Hello.
Dr.
Okay,
Opran
sir,
is
we
not present, so please proceed with the next agenda.
So the next agenda is actually an announcement from Dr. Chinmoy Saha, sir.
Yes, just give me a minute.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. So, today's talk is a LFO talk, but I would request all of your kind attention to make me a declaration that, as I was mentioning, we have received support from the highest possible level of the society, and one of them was none other than our very own Professor Tapon K. Sarkar, and who has been, always supportive to APS and MTT-S Kerala chapter. We have been blessed to interact with him on and off the field several times on several occasions. And as you know, he's a stalwart, needless to mention. And I would request Professor Siddiqui to talk about him for 5 minutes. And this is just a small tribute from our side to the great visionary and the legendary person. And I would like to just show you this, a slide where we had a virtual funeral session organized by his family, and APS Society, during March, second or third week of March during the funeral. So over to you, Professor Siddiqui.
Thank you so much, Chinmay. Thank you so much for arranging this. And I believe when compared to, Professor Sarkar, as a persona, he has touched so many of our lives, and he has shaped the IEEE even that we are doing now. But he has been very supportive over the last 2 decades in mentoring us into IEEE activities, his association, and his starring personality has touched us so much that it has touched each and every one of us life who has seen him. So I'm not really accomplished to talk about his excellence in the field of electromagnetics, but as a person, on the personal level, we have had the chance in the last 2 decades to move around with him in India and across the globe, and have seen him from very close quarters. So in that respect, Dr. Sarkar Chinmay knows, China has been associated with him probably last probably 15 years. And I would like to mention some of his personalities, some of his, so this tribute is to him or his departed soul. He was a towering persona and a brilliant mind who shaped and touched so many lives across the globe. We know him as a very remarkable professor, a researcher, as a mentor. He was a man of few words, as all of you are aware, but a man with the biggest heart and compassion. We have seen him, he loved pets, he loved wildlife and gardening, someone who also loved history. We have seen him to be very observant, but very expressionless. He always acted on his beliefs, always stood up vociferously for what he believed was right. He left India in the late 60s, but he was always deep rooted in his culture, be it his taste for music or movies or literature or food. And he was being open to experiences for his new travel because we know that he loved traveling. His act of benevolence has touched so many lives and is testimony of his big heart. He believed in the capabilities of people who worked with and was there to support them no matter what. And there are so many testimony of this benevolence. And you can ask some of the students, and there's, like they will tell you, the compassion he had for them. He was very hard from outside, but he was so soft from inside. His influence on some of our career has been so deep and broad. And we always try to emulate him in presenting, arguing, and thinking to these days. So the spirit is neither born nor does it die at any time. So neither does it cease to exist. We will definitely miss him. And I would like to share some of the photographs if I'm given this opportunity to share on my screen.
Please.
That we had the chance to interact with him for last couple of years. Okay. Can you see this screen?
Yeah.
Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, so we interacted with him on we started, I met him in APSP coaching in 2002. However, like his association with us, egging us to explore IEEE activities, to do IEEE activities, which translated into an event called the Applied Electromagnetics Conference in 2007, where me, Chinmay, Professor Kaha was the mentor, and me, Chinmay, we were involved in this event in organizing this event in Kolkata, and it was very nascent stage of our IEEE activities. Because AP MTT joint chapter Kolkata was the first AP chapter in India, and then we started to explore the IEEE activities that can be done, and he has been a great source of inspiration for us. And these are, this is a very nice frame where we see Tapan Sarkar and Professor Raj Mitra in the same frame. It's not often you see that. And this event in AMC 2009 and 2010 in Bhubaneswar Indian Antenna Week. He has been a source of inspiration for site event that we held in Kodik, because he helped us to do site activities. And this is again in Guwahati 2015. And some of the recent photographs in 2019, we had a chance to interact with him in TenCon, which was held in Kochi. And I'm showing this photograph. You can see Chinmay. This was probably the last dinner we had with him when he was in Kolkata. And I'd like to tell you that his books are still with me. He has sent 75 crates of books, and they will be distributed among students. But we discussed that we will set and probably distribute to students and to institutes. So me, Chinmay, were there in Kolkata in October 2019. When the last time we were, looking through the books and deciding, to send to keep a library. Yeah. So now probably we'll have to keep a library in his memory. And if somebody's interested, I can, share those books with you. I never had a chance to, talk about this distribution list. We made an inventory, but unfortunately that's it. So, life passes away and he'll be forever missed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sir Professor Siddiqui, for nicely, bringing some of the moments amongst the audience. And I just want to comment that the photograph you was showing during the distribution of the group that event. His house, did Durga lunch with biryani, and then he
Yes.
came to.
Chima, you're getting muted. I believe I can't hear you.
I guess there is some connectivity issue at his end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For our conference.
Yeah, so Dr. Shah, can you hear us?
Yeah. I was just mentioning. I have connected from two devices. Probably I have some difficulty with the laptop right now, my mobile. I was just mentioning that comment that the photograph Professor Siddiqui was showing, especially for the distribution of the book. That event was on a special day for Bengali. It was during Durga Puja, probably Shoptami. After the distribution of the book, got so emotional and we had a good lunch. Then after that, immediately he came to Kochi for our conference, where we had a special session on the areas of antennas and geoscience, and he supported us from the Antenna Propagation Society. And probably that was the second last time met him at a conference. Had a very nice interaction. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for, giving him a chance to talk about his life in very brief. And over to you, Ashwin. Sorry, I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
Yeah, over to Malavika.
Yeah, over to Malavika. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for sharing these memories. Now I would like to welcome the session chair, Dr. Devdeep Sarkar, to formally introduce the speaker.
Okay, yeah. So thanks, Malavika, and all the student volunteers and the young professionals who are behind this wonderful L4 series of events that IEEE MTT-S Kerala organizes. So yeah, I guess I will not take too much time, and I will just welcome our speaker, Professor ASHWIN K. Iyer, and I will read out his bio. So Professor Iyer was born in Mumbai, India in 1979, and he moved to Toronto, Canada in 1982, where he did his schooling. He received the BSc honors, MSc, and PhD degrees in electrical engineering from the University of Toronto, Ontario, Canada in 2001, 2003, and 2009, respectively, where he was involved in the discovery and development of the negative refractive index transmission line approach to the metamaterial design and the realization of metamaterial lenses for free space microwave subdiffraction imaging. So Professor Iyer is currently associated with the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, University of Alberta, Edmonton, Canada, where he leads a team of graduate students investigating novel RF microwave circuits and techniques, fundamental electromagnetic theory, sensors, antennas, and internet metamaterials, with an emphasis on their applications to microwave and optical devices, defense technologies, and biomedicine. So Professor Iyer has co-authored a number of highly cited articles and 4 book chapters on the subject of metamaterials. He is a member of the IEEE APS Education Committee. He was a recipient of the IEEE APS R.W. Peking Award in 2008, the IEEE APS Donald G. Dudley Junior Undergraduate Teaching Award in 2015, the University of Alberta Provost's Award for Early Achievement of Excellence in Undergrad Teaching in 2014, the University of Alberta Rutherford Award for Excellence in Undergrad Teaching in 2018. So you can see the number of awards and accolades he has received throughout his career. And not only him, his students are the recipients of several major national and international awards for their research, and he serves as the chair for the IEEE Northern Canada's section award-winning joint chapter of the APS and MTT-S. So Professor Iyer has served as a technical program committee co-chair for the 2015, 2016, and 2020 APSRC International Symposia, and from 2012 to 2018, he was an associate editor of the IEEE Transactions on Antennas and Propagation, and since 2019, he serves as one of the 11 international track editors. So Professor Iyer was also the guest editor of the IEEE Transactions on Antennas and Propagation special issue on the recent advances of metamaterials and metasurfaces. He is a registered member of the Association of the Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta. So with that, without further ado, I will welcome Professor Iyer, and we are all waiting to hear from him and hear on this fantastic subject of metamaterials. So over to you, Professor Iyer.
Thank you very, very much for that very generous introduction. Can you all hear me well? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll begin, first of all, by thanking my dear friend and your chairperson of the Kerala MTT-S section, Professor Chinmoy Shaha. I've known Chinmoy for so many years now, and it's really my honor and my pleasure to be giving a talk for this series and to your chapters, which are world-renowned for your volunteerism and your accomplishments, and particularly during this period when we are all seeking opportunities to come together, even though the world has restricted us from doing so. You have done a great thing by starting this lecture series. I'll start by saying that I don't consider myself either a leader or a legend. I was very humbled to be invited under that banner. But the way I would prefer to interpret that for myself is that I, like many of you, have had the opportunity to get the good wishes and blessings and education under leaders and legends. And I think this is the only thing that we as students of this discipline of electromagnetics, microwaves, and antennas, it's the most that we can hope for, is that we have access to legends in our field. And so it was particularly touching to see the tribute to Professor Sarkar. We've lost many great people. And so what I would like to say now is that all of you, particularly the young students, young professionals, take the chance to meet and interact with some of the senior members of our societies. These are people who have made stellar contributions. A lot of what we do today is based on the efforts they have taken. And so do take the chance when the world becomes normal again to go and speak with them and interact with them and receive their good wishes, as I have had the opportunity to do so. Okay, and I'll also thank all of the other attendees here. Thank you so much for attending my talk, Professor Sarkar here and Professor Siddiqui, who I know very well. And let me share my screen now. Are you able to see my screen here?
Yes, yes, Ashwin.
Okay,
Yeah.
good, thank you. Okay, so my talk, as you heard, is entitled Recent Developments in the Science of Metamaterials and Navigating the Metamaterials Landscape. This is basically two talks that I've put together here. The first half will be dedicated to some of the directions that we have taken in my research program to explore metamaterials and their applications. And then the latter half of the talk will be something on a little bit of a lighter note. Maybe you could consider it a collection of my experiences and observations on how to try to make an impact in the field of metamaterials, given how broad the scope is and how much has already been done in this field. My contact information is here, and of course I welcome any communication from anyone interested in learning more about metamaterials or about me or my research program or my students' work. Let me tell you something about the University of Alberta, first of all, and I'll put my pointer on here. So even if you don't know about Alberta, you have probably seen this photo before. The first time I saw this photo was at a relative's house in Chennai, India. It was plastered on a wall, and I just thought it was the most beautiful thing ever. And when I moved to Edmonton, Alberta in 2009, I realized that this is just a couple of hours drive from where we live. This is in Banff National Park, and it's this lake is known as Moraine Lake, and these are known as the 10 peaks of Banff. And it really truly does look like this. The water really is that color. It's something surreal to see in person. And I hope that all of you at some point have the chance to visit and see this for yourself. So Edmonton is located here where you see this dot in the province of Alberta in Canada. So we're on the western side of Canada, and we are separated from British Columbia, this province here, by the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And that's where you see the picture that I showed earlier. So this is Edmonton, Canada. You see the downtown here, and this river, which separates the downtown from the university side, and the river is known as the North Saskatchewan River. And this is a river that originates from a glacier in another national park in the mountains called the North Saskatchewan Glacier. So this is all glacial water here. The University of Alberta was established in 1908 formally as a university in Canada. Currently, it has over 37,000 students distributed among 18 faculties. And we are ranked second in Canada in terms of sponsored research revenue per year. So we have a lot of links with industry to do research with industry. The Faculty of Engineering was actually established in 1913 as a Faculty of Applied Science, or the School of Applied Science. Currently, we have about 4,400 bachelor students, 1,500 master's students, and PhD students together. And one of our claims to fame is that on our campus in Edmonton, we have something called the National Institute for Nanotechnology, which is one of the Government of Canada's centers of excellence in Canada dedicated to nanofabrication and microscopy. Our electrical and computer engineering department formally was established in 1925, but we actually hired our first professor of electrical engineering when the Faculty of Engineering was established in 1913. Right now, we have about 60 faculty members, which is one of the largest ECE departments in Canada. And 10 of us are in electromagnetics, photonics, and plasmas, and about 4 of us are in RF microwave and millimeter wave areas. And finally, our ECE department has its own nanofabrication facility, which is has about $110 million in state-of-the-art equipment. And they have a very interesting model, which is that it's completely open access. So that means anybody can use it, provided they pay the fee and get trained. And the other interesting thing about this particular nanofabrication facility is that students are encouraged to use the equipment themselves, rather than having the equipment used by technicians for the students. And so you will see at the end of my presentation several fabrications that we've done in the ECE nanofab that were actually done by my own student. Okay, now this is a picture of the university here, and I've deliberately shown you only a picture during the summer when it's nice and green. If I were to show you this picture in the winter, it wouldn't be distinguishable from the background here, which is white. So I'm not going to show you that picture. And let me tell you a little bit about myself. Most of it was already read in the biography, but I was born in India in 1979. In fact, many members of my family still live in southern India, in Chennai. I moved to Canada in 1982 and did all of my schooling there. And I received my PhD in 2009 at the University of Toronto. We started this work in 2001 when I started my graduate studies. And that's when we developed transmission line metamaterials. And then for my PhD work, we moved from the theory of transmission line metamaterials to building three-dimensional super lenses, which was the big interesting study at the time, to build a super lens that could do subdiffraction imaging. And that was the subject of my PhD research. I moved to Alberta in 2009 to take up my current faculty position. And so I have a group of graduate students now where we do several different activities related to metamaterials, but also outside the area of metamaterials. And I'll skip over some of these other activities that I do for the transactions on antennas and propagation because it was already mentioned. So I want to give credit, first of all, to my current and former graduate students, some of whom you see here depicted on the top right. Much of their work is going to be displayed later in this presentation. We have lots of new equipment in our lab. By many accounts, our lab is kind of just starting up, even though it's been going on for about 10 years. But we've recently had a few large infrastructure grants. We have an automated fully anechoic chamber antenna for antenna measurements and also specialized metamaterial measurements. And we have several VNAs and a probe station. And we acquired some fabrication facilities, including mechanical and laser-based PCB fabrication. A lot of our work, as I mentioned earlier, is supported by the National Institute for Nanotechnology and our ECE NanoFab, which is among the world's top micro and nanofabrication facilities. My research program has a balance of roughly 60% dedicated to antennas and microwave theory, and the other 40% where I venture into a little bit of physics and photonics. And this is fine because, as we know, a lot of what is done at optical frequency ranges is scaled versions of what we do in the RF microwave and millimeter wave. We have lots of industrial and academic collaborations in the area of antennas, sensors, metamaterial devices for GPS, ground penetrating radar, wireless communication, security, oil and gas, and even food safety. So now what I would like to do is give you just a short overview to some of the elements of my research program, and then to go into further detail on just a couple of them. I'll start by just talking about what metamaterials are for those who might not be completely familiar. So metamaterials are really no different than regular materials. So we really should ask the question, what are regular materials? If we tend to define regular materials in terms of macroscopic properties. For us, it's permittivity, permeability, refractive index, polarizabilities, impedance. These things are macroscopic quantities because, of course, these things make no sense if you go so deep into the scale of the atoms and molecules that constitute the material. You don't see these properties. They are the collective response of a collection, maybe a periodic array of scatterers. So when we think about material properties, what we're actually thinking about is a homogenization of this collective response. And so this is how regular materials operate. Now, the thing is that we don't have access to atoms and molecules typically to be able to engineer them such that the macroscopic properties do what we want them to do. So instead, if we can create these conditions where the size of the scatterers, the space between the scatterers is much, much smaller than a wavelength. If we can create this condition at frequencies where, let's say, the wavelengths are large enough, maybe microwave frequencies, then we might be able to design the scatterers themselves. And because we are electrical engineers, when we think of scattering and interaction with an electromagnetic wave, we might like to think in terms of voltages and currents instead. And so thinking in terms of inductors and capacitors actually makes a lot of sense to electrical engineers. And the question is, can we get networks of inductors and capacitors to interact with incoming electromagnetic waves in order to produce a response that we can engineer? And if we can engineer it, can we produce responses that you can't find in nature or which are very difficult to find in nature? And that's exactly where metamaterials originated. And the properties that are produced through engineered metamaterials can actually be very different than the properties of the materials that constitute these metamaterials. Okay, so then metasurfaces, this is a term I'll use interchangeably with metamaterials. They really just fall into the same category. Metasurfaces can be considered the 2D equivalents of metamaterials. And let me move on then to show you here a depiction on the bottom right of a metamaterial that I constructed at some point in my life. And of course, if you have access to wavelengths as short as optical wavelengths, then you can see all the features of this metamaterial. You can see the periodicity, but for wavelengths that are much longer than this periodicity here, you can imagine that maybe the metamaterial looks something like this, because the wavelength doesn't have the resolution to see the structure, but it has the resolution to see the collective macroscopic response. And this is what we mean by the effective medium. It is a range of frequencies where the wavelength is much, much longer than the scattering particles and the space between them. Okay, so now how do we go about engineering properties, basically creating scatterers to create properties that we may not find in nature or which are difficult to find in nature? Well, this was the question that motivated the development of the first metamaterials, many of which you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the wire and split ring resonator medium. A wire medium actually has been known for a very long time, several decades, actually, to produce a negative permittivity. In fact, plasmas were modeled at microwave frequencies using arrays of wires. And so if you were to homogenize the fields in an array of wires and liken it to an environment inside which you place some sort of material, then the properties of that material would be such that it has a negative permittivity. This is what I mean by homogenization. And you can see here that the permittivity, which I've plotted on the vertical axis as a function of frequency, is negative and then passes through 0 and then becomes positive. Very much like a natural plasma. It passes through 0 at its plasma frequency. Now, we did not have an analogy to this for permeability. And this is what really changed the field of metamaterials when the split ring resonator was developed. It's basically a conducting loop with a gap. Then it was shown that you could homogenize this as well, the magnetic response of this, and express it in terms of a permeability that experiences a resonance that dips low enough that it actually becomes negative over a small region of frequencies. And in the region in which the permittivity and permeability are simultaneously negative, it was determined that you could get a negative refractive index. Okay, and this is what started a lot of the excitement in the area of metamaterials. So 1950s, we have artificial dielectrics where conducting obstacles are being used to engineer the properties of natural materials, but to make them, let's say, lighter weight, for example. And then in 1998, John Pendry comes up with the idea of the split ring resonator to show that he can make an artificial magnetic medium with a negative permeability. And then approximately the year 2000, researchers at UC San Diego put together the wires and the split ring resonators to show the negative refractive index. And so this was the context in which I came into the field as a graduate student. And one of the first questions we had is, these split ring resonator and wire materials are pretty bulky, and it's not going to be easy to integrate them with printed circuits. Is there a fully circuit-based approach that we can use? And so we looked at the conventional transmission line model. Let me just get my pointer here. We looked at the conventional transmission line model, the lumped element model for a transmission line, in which propagation inside a transmission line containing a natural dielectric was represented by a series inductance and a shunt capacitance. The series inductance represented a positive permeability in the filling medium, and the shunt capacitance represented a positive permittivity. So if we were to make these permittivities and permeabilities negative, meaning how do we represent, what is the model of a transmission line that is filled with a medium that has simultaneously negative permittivity and permeability? Well, from an impedance perspective, a negative mu implies something like a negative L, and a negative epsilon implies something like a negative C. And we can simulate those conditions by replacing the L with a C and the C with an L, because this negates their impedances. And this structure here, which has this high pass kind of topology, is well known in the electrical engineering community to support backward waves, meaning waves that have a positive group velocity or power flow, but have a phase velocity that's negative, that propagates backwards towards the source. And this is also what you would expect. Oh, I think I received some kind of request to annotate. Was that intentional?
Please ignore such request.
Please ignore that, I think, yeah.
I think I already did it. So how do I get rid of it now? There, I think I got rid of it. Okay. Okay, so this structure where all you have to do is create an effective series capacitance and a effective shunt inductance should have the properties of a medium that has simultaneously negative permittivity and permeability. And this was the origin of the transmission line metamaterial. Periodically, I'll provide references, as you can see down here, to papers related to the subjects that I'm speaking about. Okay, moving on to the design of these so-called super lenses. Well, it was proposed by Victor Veselago in the late 1960s in an obscure Russian publication that if you could create a material that had a simultaneously negative epsilon and mu, you could create a negative refractive index. And then it was further proposed by John Pendry that if the medium had a negative refractive index of -1 relative to vacuum, but was also impedance matched to vacuum, then basically this would mean that epsilon is equal to minus the free space value and mu is equal to minus the free space value. Then in this case, this lens becomes a super lens. And what does that mean? It means that it is able to not only focus through negative refraction. I'll show you what that means. So it's not only able to focus through negative refraction, the propagating spectrum of a source, but it's also able to capture the evanescent spectrum of a source. And the evanescent spectrum typically decays away, which is why when we do conventional optical imaging with lenses in the far field, we have something called the diffraction limit. The diffraction limit results because of the loss of spatial information of the source when moving to the far field. That spatial information, that high spatial frequency content, is lost through evanescent waves that just decay. Evanescent waves. Somebody asked, "What is an evanescent wave?" It's a type of reactive. It's a type of wave which just essentially stores reactive energy, does not transmit real power, and decays very quickly away from a source. And so this lens is actually able to restore the amplitudes of those evanescent waves, and as such, it can recover an image of your source that contains both the propagating spectrum, as any lens would do, but also that evanescent spectrum. And what that means is it overcomes the diffraction limit. So in the middle here, this is the lens I constructed as a doctoral student that proved this concept, right? I believe it was the first free space subdiffraction imaging experiment using a lens that had a refractive index of -1. And it was done at 2.4 gigahertz. And at the University of Alberta, we took this one step further and decided to make it fully printed. The lens I built at the University of Toronto here actually had 43,000 components, including capacitors, and inductors. And you can see some of them here. It was a very expensive proposition that I had to make to my supervisor to get him to fund the construction of this lens. So it was certainly a situation of measure twice and cut once, because we didn't have a chance to build this a second time after spending the amount of money we spent on this. But when we developed this one here, where all the unit cells are actually printed, this provided the same negative refraction and amplification of evanescent waves, and resulted in a focal spot that was subdiffraction. So it actually worked as a super lens, and only cost a couple of $100s to create. So we are still looking into this, although it's been a while since we studied, since we had any projects related to super lenses. But we're now looking at making these lenses shaped, or making their refractive index profile graded in some way in order to do things like collimation or beam shaping or other types of imaging. At very high frequencies, we can consider them for quasi-optical interconnects. And because of the sensitivity of the operation of these super lenses to their environments, we would also like to see them integrated with tunable elements, maybe using ferroelectrics or phase change materials, liquid crystals, or MEMS. So that's in the works. Another study currently going on in our group is the use of metamaterials to improve resonator-based sensors. So these sensors were largely the work of my late colleague, Professor Mojgan Daneshmand, who sadly passed away in early 2020. The idea here is that you have a ring resonator, as you can see up here, with a gap in it. And then this resonator is coupled to input and output microstrip lines. And if you put something into the gap, then you'll be able to change. You'll be able to change the resonance spectrum of this resonator. And by noticing this change, you can infer the properties of the material that you've placed on the gap. So basically, this is how it works as a sensor. Now, what we learned is that when you increase the coupling between the input and output lines and the ring resonator, you can increase the sensitivity of this sensor. Now, the problem is that these ring resonators operate on a half wavelength resonance. And what that means is that this branch, let me get my pointer out here. Oops. This branch here is only lambda by 8 in size. And what we know from our understanding of microwave couplers is that these couplers are not going to be effective. They're not going to couple a good amount of the signal into the resonator unless they're about lambda by 4 in size. But of course, if the coupling length is lambda by 4, then the ring collapses into a line because the entire circumference of the ring is lambda by 2. And so how is it possible to get additional coupling when you have very short coupling lengths at your disposal? And so we started thinking about metamaterial couplers, where you can see here that I have taken this input line and output lines, and I've loaded them with series capacitors and shunt inductors according to the established theory of the transmission line metamaterial. And what this actually does, and let me get a pen out here, what this actually does is it creates this sort of backward coupling phenomenon from the metamaterial line into the line that's next to it, on one of the arms of the ring resonator. And the interesting thing about this type of coupling is that it can occur, you can get nearly 100% coupling over very, very short lengths. For those who are interested, at the end of the talk, I can explain how that happens, but I'll move beyond that for now. Needless to say, what this achieved is a very small resonator size that demonstrated approximately 100 times the sensitivity of its conventional counterpart over here. And so the way we tested it is we applied a tube consisting of certain concentrations of ethanol and methanol in distilled water on the surface of this coupling region. And then we measured the frequency shift as a function of time. And every so often, we would increase the concentrations with time. And so what you see here on the bottom is what the response is for the conventional sensor. And you can see that the frequency shifts are extremely tiny, and you don't really you're not able to discriminate between what's happening with ethanol and what's happening with methanol. When we use the metamaterial-based resonator sensor, you can see very clearly that you get large frequency shifts, which enable you to discern concentrations as little, even less than 50 parts per million, rather easily. And so this was a major achievement in the area of resonator-based sensors. We are looking at several different extensions to this work. For example, using multiple sensors to detect spatial information, and trying to also incorporate tunability, where we can tune the resonators to natural resonances of certain materials that we wish to sense. Okay, a third investigation in our group is to design very, very small antennas. Now, as you all know, when we make an antenna very small, it stops working well as an antenna. And this is for many reasons. First is that it tends to hold all of its energy inside rather than radiating it. As a result, its Q factor increases. And we want our Q factors for our antennas to be as low as possible so that they radiate. The result of holding all this energy in means that these antennas have an input impedance that is highly reactive and with very, very small real parts. And so it becomes impossible to match very small antennas. And yet there are several applications, and the number is growing, of applications where small antennas are the only option. For example, in very small wireless devices. And so we started investigating how to create very small antennas without using matching networks. And the reason is, it defeats the purpose to build a small antenna if you need a very large matching network in order to match it to a practical impedance like 50 ohms. And so what we started to do is engineer the impedance response of the antenna directly. And so I'm showing you an example here of how we did it. You can see here, this is the impedance, input impedance, both the real and the imaginary parts of the antenna as a function of frequency. And so you can see this imaginary part, it achieves a resonance here where it passes through 0. Okay, and right next to it is also an anti-resonance. So it's a resonance followed by an anti-resonance. And so typically when an antenna passes through a resonance, its real part is 0, of course, but its imaginary part, if it's a small antenna, think of an LC resonator. When it passes through its resonance, the reactance certainly goes to 0, but the resistance is very, very small for an LC resonator. Conversely, when we have such a resonator passing through an anti-resonance, once again, the reactance indeed goes to 0, but the resistance is very, very high. So we have these two different conditions. We were thinking, why not bring them together? Why not engineer the impedance of the antenna such that the resonance and anti-resonance move closer and closer together? And in doing so, technically, you have the ability to match to any impedance, including complex impedances. So here's an example where we're trying to match to 200 ohms. So you see that by bringing together this resonance and this anti-resonance, we've managed to create an impedance of 200 ohms at the resonance frequency. And so this antenna was matched to a coplanar strip line of impedance 200 ohms. And notice that this antenna, all it consists of is capacitors in the driven arm of a folded dipole and a meandered inductor on the folded arm of that folded dipole. So inherent matching, no matching network required. Of course, an antenna that is this small, it's lambda by 8 or smaller. An antenna of this size is going to be narrowband. We don't get around basic physics. So this antenna is suitable for certain applications like RFID or Internet of Things or certain sensors where the bandwidth requirement is low. And many of those sensors exist. Planar varieties of the antenna can be fully printed, as I've shown here. That's fully printed, although we can build them with surface mount elements as well, which makes it a lot easier. This is an example, this antenna here is an example of an RFID tag that we built, a highly miniaturized RFID tag. And the miniaturization is not necessarily the only benefit of such an antenna. It's actually the inherent matching. if you're using a miniaturized antenna for an RFID tag, you don't want your range to be compromised at all. But the smaller an antenna gets, the smaller its range typically becomes. And so to recover range, if you can do impedance matching, then that means that your realized gain grows because you're impedance matched. And if your realized gain is growing, then your range is also growing. We're also currently looking at a three-dimensional version of this antenna, achieving sizes of about lambda by 13. And we see that it actually approaches very closely the Chu-Harrington limits on the minimum Q and maximum bandwidth for an antenna of that size. Okay, another study, and I'll go into this in a little more detail later in the presentation, but is how we can engineer the properties of waveguides using metamaterials. And one of our most successful investigations, one of our that produced the most results, is taking a PEC metallic waveguide, a hollow waveguide, and lining it with a thin metamaterial. Now, there were a lot of studies describing filling waveguides, rectangular, circular, etc., filling them with metamaterials that have properties like epsilon near zero. And it was determined that you could transmit everything from the input to the output of the waveguide, regardless of its size, meaning that these waveguides didn't have cutoff frequencies anymore. You could transmit even if the waveguide was extremely small. You could transmit through it even if the waveguide was bent, even if the cross-section kept changing, all by virtue of filling it completely with a material that has an epsilon near zero. We considered a variation on this problem, which is, what if you wanted access to the interior of the waveguide? You couldn't do that if you filled it with a metamaterial. But you could do it if you lined it with a metamaterial, leaving the interior mostly empty. And we looked at what happens to the cutoff frequency of this waveguide as you vary the properties of this metamaterial. And what we found, interestingly, is that you can significantly lower the cutoff frequency of this waveguide, which is mostly hollow, filled with vacuum, if that metamaterial liner has properties such as a negative, a permittivity that is near zero, yes, but also negative. It's not sufficient that it be near zero. It has to be also negative and near zero. And so this resulted in several investigations in our research group, because we found through a complete analysis, dispersion analysis of these cylindrical waveguides, that they have very, very different properties. For example, the Bessel solutions for the cylindrical modes inside these waveguides have not complex arguments, which we can deal with, but complex orders. So the order of the Bessel function is actually a complex number. And just to give you an example of that challenge, we couldn't deal with this with MATLAB. MATLAB couldn't compute this. So we had to go and understand that Bessel functions could be produced through gamma functions, and then apply these complex Bessel orders as complex arguments to gamma functions, and then synthesize the Bessel functions from those gamma functions. Anyway, it was a very interesting study that we've done over the last 10 years or so, and it resulted in many outcomes. One of which was application of similar ideas in nanoporous alumina wires with radial pores. And this was done in collaboration with Professor Ananta Ramakrishna at IIT Kanpur. And you can see some of the results from that study on the right-hand side here. You get all kinds of new modal features inside these fibers consisting of these radial nanopores. Strong modal confinement, plasmonic effects can be exploited. And here's actually an experimental, a fabricated prototype where you can see the radial pores in the structure. And we investigated not just the metamaterial line PEC structures, but metamaterial coated metallic rods, which is similar to what we did here with the aluminum core and the nanoporous alumina shell, and then just shells. And we expect to use this for the purpose of building sensors, where you can actually fill the pore volumes with something like a gas or a liquid. And I want to show you what I mean by reducing the cutoff frequency of a waveguide. So what you see here on the left-hand side is a waveguide, a cross-section of a circular waveguide that is above cutoff. And of course, you can see one of the waveguide modes, let's say the fundamental mode, TE11, incident on this, this junction, where the above cutoff waveguide is interfaced with a below cutoff waveguide. Now, what you would normally expect to see is just attenuation in the form of evanescent waves. Since somebody asked about that earlier, you just see the waves attenuated and then reflected. The power would be completely reflected. But this particular below cutoff waveguide has been lined with an epsilon negative and near zero metamaterial. And so what you can see is that there's this tunneling phenomenon that takes place from the left-hand side to the right-hand side through this waveguide. And this can be designed for any size of below cutoff waveguide. We can restore propagation in a waveguide of any size using a suitably designed metamaterial. Okay. I will come back to that idea later on in the presentation. So another thing we are investigating extensively is how to engineer the functionality of microstrip devices. So here's a microstrip above a ground, as you can see here. And we started thinking about what would happen if we turned this microstrip line, which is a two-conductor transmission line, right? Microstrip and ground constitutes two conductors. What would happen if we turned it into something like a four-conductor transmission line? So all I've done here in the middle is I've etched away two gaps inside the microstrip. And so what you can see here is that there are actually four conductors here, 1, 2, 3, and then ground. So it looks something like this. And to me, this looks like a grounded coplanar waveguide type of structure. But it's not exactly a coplanar waveguide because you see that the coplanar waveguide grounds on the top layer are actually truncated. Okay, so everything happens within this width of the original microstrip structure. Now, when we go from a two-conductor transmission line to a four-conductor transmission line, we also go from supporting one mode to supporting three modes. The number of orthogonal modes in a multi-conductor transmission line of n conductors is n-1. So for four conductors that you see here, there are actually three modes. And I've depicted two of these modes here because these two modes are both what we call even modes about this line of symmetry. Okay, the one on the left-hand side here, this looks very microstrip-like. And what this means is that the potentials on these three conductors are pretty much the same. This one on the right-hand side looks very much like a coplanar waveguide, where you have something like this potential. Okay, and it's grounded. So of course there's a ground that acts parasitically on this. Now these two both, as I mentioned, exhibit an even symmetry about this plane. So is there a way that we can exploit the fact that we have these multiple modes now to get them to couple with each other? Well, of course, in a pure TEM system, these modes are orthogonal. They'll never couple with each other. But we can make them couple if we introduce some kind of scattering. And so that's what we're going to do. Let me erase all the ink on the slide. Now, look at what happens here on the top left, okay? What happens here? Now, what have I done here? All I've done is I've inserted what is basically a printed reactive loading. So here you see that there are some gaps introduced in the between the outer conductors and the underlying microstrip. And here you see there appear to be inductive connections between the outer conductors and the inner conductor. Okay, so a circuit model for something like that could look like this, where you have capacitors that are placed either in the center conductor or they're placed in the outer conductors, like this, and inductors that connect the outer conductors to the center conductor. Okay, now what does this actually do? Well, once again, let me clear the slide. Well, what this does is it causes this microstrip-like mode and the CPW-like mode to couple with each other. But first, let's look at these modes individually. When the conductors of the microstrip, I'm sorry, one second. When the upper conductors here in the microstrip-like mode are basically at the same potential, then the effect of any kind of inductive connection between these, it doesn't matter because the conductors are at the same potential. No current flows through those inductors. And so this reactive loading does not seem to really affect the microstrip mode. And so its dispersion looks like this, as you can see. It's just a line that goes up this way. However, in the CPW-like mode, you see that all of these reactive loading elements actually do have an effect. And what we find is that the CPW mode looks like it's been reactively loaded with series capacitors and shunt inductors. And if you remember from my slide on the transmission line metamaterial, this causes backward wave propagation. So now the CPW mode propagates backwards, which has this kind of a dispersion. And the microstrip mode propagates forwards. And so look, they're phase matched here, but they have anti-parallel power flow. So whereas in the microstrip, the power will go this way, in the CPW, the power goes this way. And so what does this mean? This means that the two of these modes will now couple with each other. And what this coupling does is it creates a band gap. Because if you can imagine that as you introduce more and more of these unit cells, as I've depicted on the top left, more and more of the power will couple from one of these modes into the other mode, and it'll couple backwards, which means it doesn't make it to the output. And this results in a band gap, a strong attenuation, reactive attenuation of the power, where basically all the power, real power, is reflected. Now we're going to use this to build multiband devices, to do filtering, and to build antennas that have frequency-dependent properties like polarization. And I'm going to spend some time now going into detail on some of the different structures that we have built using these, what we call metamaterial EBGs. Why do we call them that? Because they exhibit a band gap, just like conventional electromagnetic band gap structures. But the band gap is created using principles of metamaterials, transmission line metamaterials. And furthermore, the bigger advantage is that all of this can be embedded directly into microstrip devices. Some of you who know something about conventional EBG structures is that their unit cells tend to be large, on the order of λ/4 or so. These, on the other hand, because of the reactive loading, can be extremely small. Okay, so let's start with a rectangular patch antenna. Now, what I've done here is I have put metamaterial EBG unit cells on the two radiating edges of the patch antenna. And here's the result. Okay, so they've been very specifically designed. I won't go into the design right now, but here's how it works. So this patch antenna, as by virtue of inserting these metamaterial EBGs, basically becomes a dual band patch antenna. And I'll tell you why. The metamaterial EBG has two states. At some frequencies, it transmits with a certain phase. At other frequencies, it's in its band gap. And so we can exploit this as follows. So let's say that the metamaterial EBG is in its band gap. And that means none of the fields will enter into these regions. And so the resonant length of this antenna now becomes this. However, when the metamaterial EBG does transmit, then the resonant length is actually longer, is it not? So it goes all the way from up here to down here. And that's what we're showing here. So at 2.4 gigahertz, if I were to build a standard rectangular patch antenna, it would look something like this, where you see this half wavelength resonance. The metamaterial EBG achieves the same type of resonance at 2.4 gigahertz, where basically the EBG unit cells, they produce the phase of the remaining length of the standard patch antenna. But this antenna also radiates at 5 gigahertz, where the metamaterial EBG cells, as you can see here, where they don't allow transmission into the cells. And so the resonant length is constrained. And I'm comparing it here to a standard 5 gigahertz rectangular patch. And you can see that the field profile is identical between the two. So we have one antenna that is now has the functionality of two antennas by virtue of including this metamaterial EBG. And I should also mention that the reason that we've applied the EBG to both radiating edges is because we can also control the impedance matching by changing the length of this inset here using the EBG. So you can see that at higher frequencies, when the EBG is in its band gap, this becomes the inset length. And at lower frequencies, when the EBG is transmitting, this becomes the inset length. And inset length is used to control impedance matching. So we can achieve very good impedance matching, very good return loss performance by using this EBG concept as well. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, what did I do here? Hang on one second. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, and here's the fabricated structure on the top left. As you can see, it's.
I'm sorry,
I can hear someone else talking. If you don't mind, please mute your microphone. And on the bottom right, here's the return loss performance at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. It's consistent with that of the conventional patch antenna. Okay, very recently, we created a dual band, but also a dual polarization version of this rectangular patch antenna, where now what we actually have here is 2 feed points. They're microstrip pin feeds. And this patch has been designed to radiate at 3.6 gigahertz and 5.8 gigahertz. Now you see that the 2 feeds are on different axes of the patch antenna because they're trying to excite resonances on different axes corresponding to different polarizations. So here you see simulated data. If this pin feed is excited, you see the vertical resonance is created, right? And what's interesting about that is that the null of that resonance passes through the other feed. And so what that means is that the 2 polarizations should be highly decoupled from each other. When the metamaterial EBG is transmitting, then you get resonance over the full length, which implies the 3.6 gigahertz operating frequency. And when the EBG is in its band gap, then you get the resonance over a truncated length corresponding to the 5.8 gigahertz resonance frequency. And here's the data for this patch. You see here the fabricated patch, and you see the return loss performance very good agreement between simulated and measured data. These patches are narrow band. They operate in a narrow band fashion, and this is because the EBG itself is a dispersive structure. It has frequency dispersion, and so we don't get the bandwidths that we would get of a conventional patch antenna, but it's not far off. What's also important to note is the amount of isolation that you see between the 2 ports. So that's your S21. You see that at the resonance frequencies, it's down to minus 40 dB or so. And that's precisely because of the placement of these pin feeds, where one excites a resonance that puts the other one in the null of the resonance. You can also see very good agreement in their radiation patterns here and their gains as well. Maybe a simpler way to understand how this works is just to look at a simple stub. Now, think of a quarter wavelength stub that produces an open circuited microstrip stub that can be used to create a band stop filtering response. And we all know this from our basic microwave engineering courses, that if you put a quarter wavelength stub on a microstrip input-output line, then when that stub resonates, it's going to produce effectively an RF short circuit at its input, which will cause everything to reflect. Our objective in this study was, could we make this a multi-band stub without occupying any extra space? And so what we do is we put 2 metamaterial EBG unit cells here, whose band gaps are actually, they're nested one inside the other. And so this allows us to produce 3 different resonance frequencies for the exact same stub. So at 2.4 gigahertz down here, you can see the entire stub and both EBG unit cells resonate. At 3.6 gigahertz here, the uppermost EBG cell is in its band gap, but the lower EBG cell transmits. And so you get an intermediate resonance of 3.6 gigahertz. And then finally, when both EBG unit cells are in their band gap, you get the highest frequency resonance of 5 gigahertz. The left-hand side column shows the simulated fields for the EBG-based tri-band stub, and the right-hand side column shows the corresponding resonance fields of the conventional stubs at those exact frequencies. Now, one challenge that I should mention here is fabricating these stubs. We could always fabricate them, these EBGs, with lumped elements, lumped capacitors and inductors, but we wanted to make them as low cost as possible. And so we've actually tried to print them here. The features required for this design, these are interdigitated capacitors with feature sizes of about 50 microns. And we could only really accomplish this with a laser-based fabrication. And even then, there was a little bit of a tolerance associated with this fabrication, as I'll show you on the next slide. Here is the S parameter data for this stub, and you can see that there is generally good agreement between simulated and measured data. We have 3 band stop frequencies here, so 2.4, 3.6, and 5.8. And there's about a 2% shift between simulated and experimental data. And this 2% shift implies that maybe we didn't get 50 micron resolution in our fabrication. We might have had 48 or 44 or something like that. Okay, another idea is to use this EBG in a different way. Okay, so just to revisit the dispersion diagram of one of these EBGs, you see here, this is frequency on the vertical axis plotted against the phase across a single unit cell. Okay, now the shaded region here is the band gap of the EBG. And so what you see is that because we produce that band gap, we can actually have 2 nearby frequencies that share the same phase across one unit cell. Now consider something like a quarter wavelength transformer. This transformer, it can be used for impedance matching. Let's say as an example here, you have a 50 ohm input line, you have 2 50 ohm output lines. And so basically you need a quarter wavelength transformer to transform 25 ohms into 50 ohms. Okay, and how would we build this? Well, we know the standard formula. We would design an intermediate transmission line of a quarter wavelength length at the desired operating frequency, whose impedance is the geometric average of 25 and 50. This is what we would do, right? Could I do this at 2 frequencies? No. 2 harmonically related frequencies, yes. I mean, this would work when it's lambda by 4, but also 3 lambda by 4. Okay, but I'm not here to exploit harmonically related frequencies. I would get this out of natural conventional microstrip structures. But I want to do this at arbitrary frequencies. And so what I do is I insert a metamaterial EBG unit cell, and then I look at the 2 frequencies where I can achieve that 90-degree or quarter wavelength phase. As you can see, I can design the dispersion diagram here. I can design the dispersion diagram to produce 90 degrees at 2 different frequencies on either side of this band gap. Okay, and this is where the dispersion engineering happens. There are many, you can't arbitrarily choose a unit cell. You have to choose the loading and the geometry of this multi-conductor transmission line in order to produce these particular values. And so in this case, we've designed it for 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. Let's see what the data looks like. Okay, so as you can see here, we do achieve matching, so better than 20 dB at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz here. And in addition, you get a strong rejection band between the 2 operating frequencies of 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. Also, because this is so easy to design and intuitive in its operation, you can see we always tend to achieve very good agreement between simulation and experiment. Here's an example of a Wilkinson power divider that is built using metamaterial EBGs, but in a slightly different fashion here. Let me show you how this works. So at 1 frequency, let's say in this case it's designed for 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. At 2.4 gigahertz, the signal path that is followed goes like this. It takes these outer branches here. Okay, so you can see that I have EBG unit cells both in the outer branches and in these inner branches here. So what happens at 2.4 gigahertz is that the outer branch EBGs are transmitting, but the inner branch EBGs have been designed to be in a band gap. Now, at the other operating frequency of 5 gigahertz, it's the opposite. Instead of taking the outer branches, the signal takes the inner branches. So at 5 gigahertz, the inner branch EBG is transmitting, but the outer branch EBG is in its band gap. And once again, this employs about 50 micron microstrip features to realize. But you can see that we achieve pretty good results. So it does in fact work at the designed operating frequencies. Okay, here's an example of a branch line coupler that is designed to be dual band at the two North American GPS L1 and L2 frequencies. So 1.228 and I believe 1.575 gigahertz. And same idea here is that we design the EVGs to achieve certain phase properties across them, while also being impedance matched to the original microstrip. And the reason for that is that because they're built directly into the original microstrip. We've removed conductor from the original microstrip, but we've maintained its original width. Okay, now filtering. Filtering seems natural for an EBG. The problem is that conventional EBGs are very difficult to integrate into microstrip filters because those EBG unit cells are very large. Think of something like the Sieven-Piper EBG or the uniplanar compact EBG, the UC EBG. They're very large unit cells. We don't think of embedding them into microstrips. Here, we're going to do exactly that. So one thing to notice is that if you look at the capacitance in the unit cell of the multi-conductor EBG structure, this capacitance has a strong effect on the band gap frequencies of this EBG. I've shown up here on the top right what happens when you increase that capacitance while maintaining the geometry of the multi-conductor transmission line. Well, we lower the band gap frequencies, so its center frequency is lowered. As you can see down here, the center frequency is basically this solid line. You can see how it lowers as I increase the capacitance. But what also reduces is the band width of that band gap. That also reduces. Now this could make a good filter, but the problem here is that this filter, as you tuned its capacitance, would produce changing filter bandwidths. So changing band stop bandwidths. And that's a problem because for most applications, we have bands that all have the same bandwidth. And so if we want to make a tunable filter, we would want that bandwidth to stay constant as we tune the filter. So we don't want a constant fractional bandwidth. So we don't want something that's always 1% or 2% bandwidth. We want something that's always, let's say, 200 megahertz. Okay, so a constant absolute bandwidth is what we want. Okay. Let's see. I don't know why this keeps happening, but okay. So the first thing we're going to do is take 3 of these metamaterial EBG unit cells and cascade them in order to produce a filtering response in the band gap that achieves a certain desired insertion loss. In this case, it's between 20 and 30 dB of insertion loss in the rejection band. So we fabricate it, and you can see that experiment and simulation are once again pretty close. Now to make this tunable, this is the idea that we had. So there's in making tunable filters, the holy grail is to be able to create constant absolute bandwidth with a single tuning element. So certainly we can vary all the different elements of a filter independently. If you had access to every one of them, you could make any response you wanted. But this is not what we call a synchronous tuning approach. We want one tuning element that tunes all the attributes of the filter simultaneously. So this is how we did it. We want to change the capacitance of each of these underlying unit cells. So what we did is we did a mechanical type of tuning where we put a dielectric plate of a certain dielectric constant above the 3 unit cells, and then we would move this plate in order to do tuning. Now the thing is this, as you move the plate, if the plate were homogeneous across all 3 unit cells, then all 3 unit cells would detune in the same way. Their capacitance would change uniformly. And what this would mean is that our bandwidth would decrease as the center frequency decreased. But we don't want that. We want the 3 unit cells to be tuned differently such that we maintain a constant absolute bandwidth. So to do this, what we did is that we perforated the unit cells, we perforated the dielectric plate. And you can see that there are no perforations over here. There are some perforations in the middle, and there are more perforations on the right-hand side here. And we chose these perforations strategically in order to maintain a constant absolute bandwidth. So what you can see at the top here on the top right is that as the filter response is tuned, meaning as this plate is being moved, you can see the rejection bands moving from up here in the 4.1 gigahertz range all the way down to about the 3.5 gigahertz range, which is where we stopped because we wanted to meet this roughly minus 20 dB rejection condition. And we've maintained the bandwidth pretty well. In fact, if you look at the data down here, this shows you the 10 dB bandwidth of each of these rejection bands. This graph at the top here, so let me get my pointer again. This is what you would get for the bandwidth if this dielectric plate were not perforated, meaning if all the unit cells were tuned in the same fashion. Then you can see that the bandwidth changes with center frequency. But with our perforation approach, we see that the bandwidth stays between this range here, around 220 megahertz, around the center frequency. So we've achieved constant absolute bandwidth with a single tuning element. And for those of you who are wondering why we decided to do this mechanically, why tune this mechanically, it's because this was being developed for an application where passive intermodulation was a serious issue. And so if you use any kind of nonlinear elements, varactors or anything like this to do tuning, you're going to introduce a crazy amount of nonlinearity, which will exacerbate the problem of intermodulation. And we had very strict limits on intermodulation. They had to be below minus 130 dB M. And so mechanical was the only way to go that didn't introduce these nonlinearities. Okay, so to conclude on the side of the metamaterial EBGs, these are extremely versatile devices. They can take fundamental microwave circuit and microstrip in particular components and antennas and make them multifunctional. So we've seen being able to route through different paths using this EBG, being able to change the electrical length as a function of frequency, being able to design the phase shift across these EBGs as a function of frequency. We can basically choose arbitrary operating frequencies. They don't have to be harmonically related anymore. They are fully uniplanar and they can be fully printed. They're also fully embedded, so we don't require space outside the microstrip itself. And this is very important. We don't, in terms of real estate, you literally just drag and drop them into your microstrip devices. And we've shown mechanical tunability. Right now, we're working on integrating multiple metamaterial EBG devices into one system. So for example, a feed network, a dual band feed network that also feeds a dual band dual pole antenna. We're looking at a greater range of devices. For example, right now we're looking at multi-band double stub tuners. The double stub tuners that we study in our undergraduate microwave engineering courses. Can we make them multi-band simply by putting metamaterial EBG cells into the existing stubs? We want to look at producing more bandwidth out of these bands, maybe extend some of these concepts to the millimeter wave regime where we can't use surface mount chip elements, so we have to use printed approaches, and addition of tunability again, using now, other than mechanical, ferroelectrics, phase change materials, etc. Chinmoy, would you be able to give me just a sense of how much time I have left?
I think you can take another 20 minutes or so.
20 minutes? Okay. Okay, I'll do my best to fit it in that time.
Is that fine?
So I think it might be a little bit over maybe 25 minutes.
Yeah. Fine. Feel free.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk about some of our work in the area of aperture-based resonant metasurfaces. Okay, and the work that goes all the way from the microwave frequency range to the near infrared, and in fact into the visible, which I won't show here, but you can see the logical extension to. So a bit of a classification first. Think of apertures in a metallic screen. Now this was studied decades ago by Hans Bethe, where he looked at what he observed is that as holes in a screen got smaller and smaller, you naturally observed less and less transmission through them. And where you observed a great deal of transmission is when the holes were resonant in size. And that's because a hole in a metallic screen is no different than the cross-section of a circular waveguide. It has the cutoff frequencies of the modes of a circular waveguide are actually the resonance frequencies of holes in a screen. But now let's say holes are very, very small and you don't expect much transmission through them. Well, even in this area, it was observed that you could get unusually strong transmission through an array of holes, even though the holes were very sub-wavelength in size. How did this happen? This was known as extraordinary transmission. And eventually, after many, many years of debate and back and forth, it was learned that what was actually going on is that even though the holes were sub-wavelength themselves, the space between these arrays of holes, the period, was on the order of a wavelength. And so what you were actually doing was coupling to diffraction grading, what are called diffraction grading anomalies, which were studied a long time ago as well by Wood and Rayleigh. And these anomalies, you can also envision this as coupling to a leaky wave mode on the surface of this periodic structure. So inspired by that, we started thinking about how this might be related to things like frequency selective surfaces. Well, this is on the other side of the spectrum, okay? So for frequency selective surfaces, you have resonant apertures, basically. And the apertures don't have to be circular. They can be any shape, really. But they're resonant in size. And so these radiate very similarly to antenna arrays, aperture antenna arrays. Okay, then we can look at another category, however, where let's say the apertures themselves are resonant as they are in the frequency selective surface, but we have miniaturized them somehow. One way to miniaturize them maybe is to fill their dielectric environment with a high permittivity dielectric, such that that resonance occurs even though the size of the aperture is very small relative to a free space wavelength. So we could call this a resonant type metasurface. And in optics, it's used all the time. The term metasurface is used. But is there a way to make these very small apertures resonant without filling them with dielectrics? Well, this sounds very similar to what we said earlier about waveguides. Is there a way to reduce the cutoff frequency of a waveguide or make it smaller? Both mean the same thing. Without filling the entire volume of the waveguide. And what did we do there? We lined the waveguide with a metamaterial liner. So could we line these apertures with metamaterial liners and get transmission through them, even though they're very much smaller than a free space wavelength? So that's what I'm trying to show here. You remember this animation that I showed earlier about transmission through a waveguide. What is an aperture except a collapsing of this waveguide into a screen, the length of a waveguide into an aperture in a screen? So let's now consider apertures in a metallic screen that are lined with a metamaterial that exhibits a negative and near zero permittivity. And this is where we start our study of surfaces. Okay, so here I've created an array of apertures, okay? And I have lined them all with a transmission line metamaterial exhibiting a negative and near zero permittivity at 2.4 gigahertz. The aperture diameter is about lambda by 4 here. So it's not extremely small, but it's certainly smaller than the first resonance that this aperture would experience. This is the transmission response that we obtain from this array of apertures. So I've shown in dashed lines what you would expect from apertures that have no metamaterial liners. So what you can see here is that the green is basically reflection. You get almost 100% reflection because the apertures are too small. They're not resonant at these frequencies. And the amount of transmission you get is somewhere between, I don't know, about 7 and 10 dB, -7 and -10 dB. There's still some transmission because these apertures are not extremely small, but they're still small. Now, when you put the metamaterial liners on them, you see that you get this very interesting type of transmission response. So you have a resonance followed by something like an anti-resonance. And the contrast between the resonance and anti-resonance is on the order of 25 to 30 dB. And if you just look at the anti-resonance, it provides you, let me get my pen here, it provides you 18 dB better shielding performance at that frequency than if the apertures did not have metamaterials in them. So you see that you can appreciate the difference between an aperture that has a metamaterial and doesn't have a metamaterial. The only difference is it doesn't have this little ring. Otherwise, it's still essentially empty. And you can see that just by introducing that metamaterial ring, you get this additional shielding effect. So shielding is a potential application of these metamaterial lined apertures. But there are other applications that I want to focus on for this talk here, which I think you will find interesting. But first, have a look at the fields inside the aperture. So you see that the fields are essentially collimated inside the aperture. And this is something that we observed even in the metamaterial lined waveguides. Here's what we built. You can see these radial inductors, very similar to the shunt inductors of the transmission line metamaterial. You can see these series capacitive gaps periodically in the azimuth, and the rest of the aperture is essentially empty. So we did an experiment where we have a magnetic dipole here illuminating this aperture array very much in the near field in order to improve the numerical aperture. And then we have a rectangular probe antenna on the opposite side collecting the fields in order to determine directivity. And so that's what I'm going to show you here. What you see here is just for we have a similar array where we don't have metamaterial liners. We just have empty apertures. And this is the response that we get, simulation versus experiment. Simulation is dotted, experiment is solid. And this is what we get now when we insert the metamaterial liners. Once again, you see a very strong difference in, you see a strong contrast difference between the resonance and the anti-resonance, and strong shielding relative to the apertures that don't have metamaterials. Right, and we had to do some adjustment on the simulation to account for about 2% error in the calculated inductance. You know that the inductors that you purchase always have some sort of a tolerance, and in our case, accounting for that 2% tolerance got pretty good matching with our simulated data. I mentioned I wanted to show you an interesting example of this, of the use of these resonant apertures. Remember, these apertures are very, very subwavelength. Okay, and they have distinct resonances associated with them, which have very sharp contrasts between resonance and anti-resonance. So I'm going to show you an approach to do magnification in the far field of subdiffraction features. Okay, now that requires a little bit of an explanation on the diffraction limit. So as I mentioned earlier, to do imaging in the far field, you're always constrained by the diffraction limit, and this is because the higher spatial frequency components of the image spectrum, of the source spectrum, these are carried by evanescent waves. And evanescent waves decay rapidly away from the source, so they never make it to the far field. How do you then produce these fine features in the far field? Well, the only way is to get access to the near field. And so, for example, in a near field scanning optical microscope, we can sample very close to the surface of an object, and we get resolution better than the diffraction limit. And that's because we're actually sampling these evanescent waves before they decay. But now, how do we do this in the far field? I mean, certainly we could take some sort of a fiber optic cable from the near field and take it all the way to the far field, and we'll get the measurement. But we want to do this in a wireless fashion. And so this is an approach that we have. There are other approaches that have been able to do it. I won't go into them now in the interest of saving time. I'll just show you what we did. Can we use our aperture arrays? So here's once again a metamaterial lined aperture loaded with inductors. And what I want to draw your attention to is this graph on the bottom left that shows you what happens to this resonance profile, resonance anti-resonance profile, as the inductance is changed. Now what you can see is that I can shift it in frequency. Okay, and the way I've shifted it here is that I have chosen intervals of inductance such that if I increase the inductance, I place the new resonance at the location of the anti-resonance of the previous case. Okay, so what does this mean? This means if I array, let's say 5 of these unit cells okay, periodically, each of them having a different inductance, what I end up with is a spectrum in the far field. If I just look at the bore sight direction of what is transmitted by this array, I see 5 resonances corresponding to the individual resonances of these unit cells. Now, what's interesting about this is that the 5 resonances are easily distinguishable in the far field. But from a diffraction limit perspective, these apertures are very small. They're lambda by 6 in size. And so any information where there's there are spatial features on the order of lambda by 6, we would not be able to recover this in the far field because lambda by 6 is below the diffraction limit. Anything that differentiates these apertures on the scale of lambda by 6 would be completely lost in the far field. And yet we get 5 distinct peaks corresponding to each of these apertures. So can we use this for the purpose of imaging? So we built it. So you see that now we've printed the inductors once again, we've printed the inductors rather than using surface mount inductors, specifically because we didn't want that 2% error. We wanted to be able to control the inductance ourselves. And the simulation tells us once again that we get 5 distinct resonances corresponding to these different apertures. You can see here how the meandered inductors occupy more space here and less space here, right? So you can see how the inductance changes. And now look what happens. I should tell you what I'm doing here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to block one of these apertures at a time. And what you'll see is that one of these resonances disappears corresponding to the blocked aperture, but all of the other ones are left intact. Okay, so as I go sequentially from aperture to aperture blocking it, you see that I lose one resonance at a time. Now what this tells you is that I'm able to recover subdiffraction information then in the far field, because what I've done is I've mapped a location in space corresponding to one aperture to a particular resonance frequency in the frequency spectrum. So I've mapped space to frequency. And even if I cannot spatially do a diffraction, a subdiffraction imaging, if I cannot do subdiffraction imaging spatially, I can do it through the frequency spectrum. Because anytime I block off one of these apertures, I see a change in the frequency spectrum. Now, if I subtract the response with and without the obstacle blocked, then I get these nice peaks here that tell me which obstacle is blocked. Okay, so we built it, and this was a very difficult exercise actually, because we had to simulate the conditions of a plane wave while only having to build one of these segments of 5 unit cells. And so we had to build a custom TEM horn antenna, as you can see here, to try to produce plane wave-like fields. And indeed, we observed these 5 resonances, and when we apply conducting obstacles to each of them, one resonance disappears at a time. And when we take the differences, you get your 5 peaks. So we were able to actually do subdiffraction imaging, but not really. We're basically taking that subdiffraction information from the near field, frequency multiplexing it, and sending it to the far field so that we can detect distributions of obstacles on these apertures that we wouldn't be able to detect by any optical means. Now, how do we take this to optical frequencies? Okay, so you see here what I've got. I've got my metamaterial lined aperture at 2.4 gigahertz, and I've also shown you what the fields in that aperture look like when it's resonating. Now, what if I built this out of gold, and the inductors were these little segments here, and the capacitors are these gaps? I seem to get similar resonant behavior, but I get it in the near infrared. Now, there's another way I can modify this, which is to increase the length of those inductors, right? And then put the capacitors right at the center here, as you can see. So this unit cell and this unit cell are 2 extremes of all the different designs I can do. And you can see they all exhibit a resonance profile. So I'm going to design these to operate around the 1550 nanometers, so telecommunications wavelength, 1550 nanometer wavelengths. And what you see here is that for this design, you get once again a resonance and an anti-resonance. And in this case, they're separated by almost 35 dB. So even higher resonance contrast. I'm going to skip a little bit here. But one thing I'll mention is that for these apertures can also be made extremely small. So can we do a similar far field diffraction, subdiffraction type of measurement? Maybe. The other thing is that the apertures are not sensitive to the period of the structure. So this is not an extraordinary transmission type phenomenon that relies on diffraction and grating anomalies. Each individual aperture contributes a resonance, and an array of them simply, they add on top of each other, like an antenna array. But each aperture is resonant and each aperture transmits. Okay, so here is, as I mentioned, the two ends of the, two extremes on the design of these apertures. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you what happens as I slowly increase the length of those radial inductors to go from one end of the spectrum to the other. And you can see a change in the resonance spectrum. Another thing I can do is I can change the filling factor of the aperture. So the overall aperture is made smaller while the period is remains constant. And you can see this also allows us to change the resonance, the spectrum. Now I've chosen 3 designs from all of those cases here, as you can see. And the reason I've chosen these designs is because their resonances can roughly be distinguished at the 3 dB mark here. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a simulation in numerical where I have these apertures etched into a 50 nanometer gold film backed by a 400 nanometer section of lithium fluoride substrate. And it's periodic boundary conditions. So this array of 3 distinct apertures is constantly repeated. And what I'm going to show you here is a movie where we're going to cycle through frequency. So we're going to go from low frequencies to high frequencies, 100 terahertz to 400 terahertz. And this is the spectrum that I observe, as you can see down here, 3 distinct resonances. Now the question is, which resonance corresponds to which aperture? You wouldn't be able to tell anything about these apertures in the far field because they are because they're so close together and they're so small. So this is all below the diffraction limit. But if you observe their their fields as we move through the spectrum, you'll see which resonance corresponds to which aperture. So here we go as we cycle through frequency. So there you go. The first resonance in frequency corresponds to aperture 3. The second resonance corresponds to aperture 1. And the third resonance actually corresponds to aperture 2. All right. So I'll skip a lot of this here, okay, which shows that even in this optical, in this near infrared example, you can cover apertures and only a single resonance disappears while maintaining all the others. And with very strong, you can see the difference here. If I cover, for example, this middle aperture, the third resonance disappears, and the difference between the resonance being there and not being there is about 18.5 dB. That's a major difference between the two. It's a major contrast. Now, we moved on to the fabrication of these apertures, and this is a major challenge because the apertures themselves are only 300 nanometers across, and they have 10 nanometer wire features. You can't do this with e-beam lithography. So what we decided to do is try it with focused ion beam milling. And this is a process where something like a microscope that uses ions in order to do imaging is repurposed for the purpose of milling. So it uses the same ions to do milling. And in this case, it's helium ions being used to do milling. And we were able to achieve, as you see here, long-range reproducibility of these apertures. And if you look closely, each of the wires is only 8 nanometers in thickness. And for some context, 8 nanometers is just under 50 atoms in thickness. And so this was an extreme challenge. It had never been done before. And in fact, the manufacturers of this nanofab machine, Zeiss, featured this in their newsletter because it was a pretty amazing achievement even by their standards. And the credit goes to my student, Mitchell Semple, who spent the time figuring out how to get the machine to achieve these kinds of reproducible resolutions. Okay, conclusions on this section. Resonant-based aperture metasurfaces, these can be very versatile. Their resonance frequency is insensitive to their period, so you can even make them sort of randomized in their orientation. And they have several applications that we're currently looking into related to manipulating the phase and the magnitude of incident waves. Okay, so now let me go briefly through some ideas on navigating this metamaterial landscape. The basic problem that I think a lot of new entrants into the field see is that metamaterials is now over 2 decades old. So a lot has happened. And even before the first metamaterials were published, were discussed, there's a long history of precursor discoveries that led to that. I, as a graduate student, had to go back about 100 years in order to find all of the foundational information that enabled me to understand metamaterials and how they came about. There are also so many research groups worldwide, and to really understand metamaterials, it seems you need to have a knowledge of material science, crystallography, condensed matter physics, plasmas. So many things come into it. These all seem to present great challenges to students thinking, you know, can I make an impact in a field like this? You know, how will I be able to do this given all that has already happened? And how will I be able to become well versed in all of the tools and techniques that are needed? So I'll give you a set of recommendations based on my own experience over 10 years as a graduate student and another 10 years as a professor leading a research group. So the overwhelming breadth and diversity, this is actually, I can't tell you that this is not true. There is an overwhelming amount of breadth and diversity in metamaterials. In just the subjects that I've discussed today, you've seen issues of, terminology from electronics, circuit theory, microwave antennas, material science, photonics, plasmonics, and it involves advanced mathematics and numerical techniques. Metamaterials has actually made an entrance into so many different disciplines, like even acoustics. We have acoustic metamaterials. It's made an entrance into seismology, where we're trying to create things like invisibility cloaks that cloak buildings from seismic waves, earthquakes, cosmology even. We've had to have concurrent developments in nanofabrication and computing as well. And then so many different implementations related to all of these different fields and new things coming up all the time. We're now adopting a lot of studies that are being done in physics into metamaterials. For example, notions of topological materials, PT symmetry, non-reciprocal materials, time-varying materials, plasmonics, now using things like artificial intelligence to synthesize various different field transformations using metamaterials. There's a lot happening here. And so there's no real substitute for hard work in reading about all of these areas. You have to commit to becoming well versed in most of these areas. To give you an idea of the proliferation of metamaterial works, consider just in this graph, I'm showing you at least until the year 2020, the number of papers on metamaterials and metasurfaces. So basically, using keywords metamaterial and metasurface in their titles, right? Certainly there are more if you look into the actual text of the papers, but just from the titles, there are over 43,000 documents distributed across 120 journals. And you can see the growth from 2000, roughly when the first metamaterials were created, the negative index metamaterials, until now. You see the trajectory is it's skyrocketing. And metasurfaces starts around 2010, and you see even has a faster trajectory. And now, what about the very long history that I described? Well, if you really want to look at the origin of metamaterials, you have to go as far back as the periodic structures that were investigated by people like Jagdish Chandra Bose, looking at chiral structures and Lindman, and there were indications of ideas like negative refraction as early as about 1904 by people like Horace Lamb and Arthur Schuster. We have several studies in the area of artificial dielectrics in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Then we have Veselago's work in 1968 that predicted the negative index property. And then we have all of the realization attempts in the late 1990s and early 2000s that led to all of the metamaterial implementations that we have today. So we're talking about over a 100-year history here. as I said, no substitute for hard work. You have to develop proficiency in multiple areas related to your project. And I believe personally that a study of the recent literature is important, but equally important is to study the classical literature, because we have this problem of sometimes reinventing things that have already been done and studied in the past. And that's something we should all be afraid of. We don't want to make a name for ourselves by reinventing things that are already known, that we just didn't look deeply into. So to prevent that, it's very important to look as far back into the past as possible. Of course, all of you will be taking very important courses like EM theory, antennas, numerical methods, but additional courses that might be project specific in condensed matter physics or plasmonics or nanofabrication as well. These would be important. My recommendation to supervisors is that an enriching experience in designing metamaterials projects is to design the projects such that they span the entire gamut, the entire life cycle, from theory to design, simulation, fabrication, and then finally experiment. Okay, and for students, make sure that you foster the habit of reading papers regularly, because the field evolves very, very quickly. What about digital resources now? We need to talk about that. Most of us turn to the internet first, and that's fine. But the issue is the relevance of your search results. How do you know that the search results are going to be useful to you? Google uses artificial intelligence-based algorithms to discern relevance, but produces a massive number of hits, and you can't possibly read through all of them. You have Wikipedia, of course. This is crowdsourced information, but it's completely unvetted in the sense that there's no peer review here, or let's say there's no academic peer review. Although I read a study that says that the Encyclopedia Britannica, on average, has the same number of errors as Wikipedia, so it may not actually be a problem. Where we should go is to online publication databases. So many of these, like the IEEE, have archived works going way back. The IEEE has gone as far back as 1913, before it was even known as the IEEE. And several journals are now indexed. In fact, we now have lots of new journals, and this actually presents a bit of a problem because there's a wide variability in peer review standards. Not all journals have the track record to offer high quality peer reviews. And so you should be discerning and judicious about which journals you choose to read and cite in your own papers. I believe that libraries are still very relevant because not all references can be found online. It's not as simple also as just inserting a keyword into Google and then having it spit results at you. It requires some serious effort and time commitment. So you want to make sure that you actually put in a lot of effort to narrow down your searches when you go to a library, which you don't necessarily do when you search in Google. You're more indiscriminate when searching online. And being in a library is an experience in and of itself. My personal experience is that I retained much better the things that I went and searched for that I could handle physically. Let me move on here. This is an important one. When it comes to the accuracy of simulators, we know that electromagnetic simulators have various different methods: FDTD, finite element, method of moments, and these are all essential to the study of metamaterials and metasurfaces. And which one you choose depends on a lot of things. What is the complexity of your structure? What's its electrical size? What kind of boundary conditions will you require? Are you interested in time or frequency domain? And what are your computational resources? If you have a lot of RAM, for example, you might choose to do you might choose an FEM type of approach. Whereas if you have a small amount of RAM but faster computational power, you might choose a different approach. In fact, I would argue that the advent of metamaterials and metasurfaces has arguably driven the development of electromagnetic solvers. So for example, in the area of periodic boundary conditions or inserting lumped elements into metamaterials, a lot of this functionality did not exist until there was a need in the area of metamaterials. And remember that the accuracy of simulators is really only as good as the data you supply. If you supply data that's not good, if you supply boundary conditions that are not realistic or sources that are not realistic, the results you get are not trustable. And the accuracy, of course, is never 100% because it depends on so many things, including how you discretize the simulation domain and how you apply your convergence criteria. I'm going to give you an example of why simulators have limits. So, and this is from my own research group. This is a single unit cell of a meta surface that we designed where the unit cell itself is 18 millimeters by 18 millimeters, so about lambda by 7 by lambda by 7. But the minimum feature size is 100 microns, and so that's lambda by 1250. For simulating one unit cell, we required 500 gigabytes of RAM, just one unit cell, to do an eigenmode simulation. And even that needed a workstation to do. Now, if I were to do this array that you see on the bottom right, which is 16 by 12 elements, I would need 96 terabytes of RAM to simulate, which we don't have access to. So some problems like this are still computationally prohibitive and limited. So we still have to make limiting assumptions, use semi-analytical approaches, or even just build it directly. Okay, I'm going to skip a couple of these things here. Okay, one thing that I wanted to jump to is that there's a lot of promise in metamaterials, but there's also a lot of hyperbole, and it's important to show skepticism. Okay, so the early discoveries of the super lens and cloaking, these things generated a lot of interest, and we saw newspaper articles that said things like this: "The Harry Potter invisibility cloak is real," and this sounded great. And it featured metamaterials, but I believe it did us a disservice in this community because it created unrealistic expectations of what we were doing. And so it's important for us now to prove the promise of metamaterials by moving from theory to commercial applications, just so that we can make it a mainstream technology. Okay, so in conclusion, embarking on research in metamaterials is going to require a lot of work and time and effort. But it's definitely worth it. There's lots yet to be discovered and lots of scope for each of you to make substantial contributions. So with that, I'll end my talk, and I'd like to thank the IEEE Kerala section, MTT-S chapter, and the student branch of the Government Engineering College at Barton Hill. And here's a picture of me with Professor Shaha when we met in Kolkata several years ago. It's memories of that which I treasure. I'm very happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ASHWIN. Now, session chair will take over. Dr. Sarkar.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor ASHWIN, for this nice and informative talk. And I think it had content for, all the graduate students as well as young professionals and early career faculty members like me who are interested to pursue this domain as a research direction. So we had a pretty whole bunch of content that we can probably work on in the future. So thank you a lot for that. So well, I can see a lot of questions in the chat box, but probably I will not be able to take all of them for the interest of time. So I'll take a couple of questions. So Professor ASHWIN, you can probably respond to them. So I guess one of the participants have asked that what is the transmission model of positive permittivity and negative permeability? So can you just once more elaborate on that?
The transmission line model for positive permittivity and negative permeability?
Negative permit, yeah.
So positive permittivity for the transmission line model would imply a shunt capacitance, and a negative permeability would imply a series capacitance. So it's a ladder network of capacitors, essentially. Yeah. And we can see that this would not permit propagation, as you would expect. When one of epsilon or mu is negative, it doesn't permit propagation.
Right. So like another question that the same person is asking, like, can we get high refractive index with single negative material? So any comments on that?
So a high negative refractive index with this is an interesting question. I mean, the refractive index is going to necessarily be imaginary if the material is single negative, meaning single negative means either epsilon or mu is negative, not both. And if that's the case, the refractive index, which is the square root of their product, is going to be imaginary. And so I'm not sure I understand the question, because you can get a high imaginary value if you wish, but it
Right.
won't be of much use.
I guess then it will be probably not supporting the propagating waves also. I mean, if
Exactly, that's right. Yeah.
So, so another question that a person, I think Ramya is asking, that how to calculate the resonating frequency of meander line, and how to make it or useful for miniaturization. Probably she's asking about some highly cited paper. I don't know about that.
I'm sorry.
Like
How to calculate what? I
the
couldn't hear just for a
resonating
second.
frequency. Yeah, the resonating frequency of a meander line.
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, you have a meandered trace of conductor on a dielectric of some sort, and you want to know its resonance frequency. Is this right?
Right.
Okay,
Right,
so
right.
this presumes that in addition to inductance, this meandered line has some parasitic capacitance. And so the resonance is the interaction of that inductance with the parasitic capacitance. How do you find it? Without, I mean, using a simulator, you sweep across a range of frequencies where you expect that resonance, and you'll find it. I think maybe I'll answer the question. I'll answer a slightly different variation of the question, which is that if you want to know the inductance and capacitance corresponding to a meandered line, how would you do it? Let me answer that question.
Yes.
So the way that we could extract it using something like EM tool like HFSS is you would put this meandered trace in between two transmission lines, known transmission lines. Let's say it's a microstrip, and you put in this trace in a series fashion between the two microstrips. Then you do a simulation of all the S parameters over a frequency range, and then you de-embed those simulated results to the ends of the meandered trace. And now what you do is now you have a 2-port S parameters just for the trace. You can convert these to something like a Z matrix or a Y matrix, right? Using a conversion of S parameters to Z or Y. In this case, I would probably choose a Y matrix. And the reason for that is that you can then relate a 2-port Y matrix to a pi network. And that pi network has 2 shunt elements and then a series element. And the series element is probably going to be the impedance or the admittance of your meandered trace. Now that series element, series admittance, you can reasonably assume that admittance is a series combination of L and C. So this meandered trace is an LC series network. And maybe I'll take it offline for whoever asked the question. You can certainly email me and I can give you the math for it, but there is a way to uniquely extract the L and the C once you know that admittance.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So yeah, I guess a couple of more questions. So I can see Christine asking that I think in slide 11, how waveguides work with MMT technique. So like, can you elaborate on that?
Waveguides work with MNG?
MMT. I don't know. I think probably metamaterial. I forgot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
How waveguides work with the metamaterial technique?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know how in depth you want me to go in this, but the principle is basically this. The metamaterial will alter the spectrum of resonant modes, and that's it. It creates a different set of boundary conditions. Okay. I'll give you an example by sharing my screen. Let's see here. Let me go to some supplementary slides here. Yeah, so this is a traditional waveguide, okay, and filled with just vacuum, and it has a spectrum of resonant modes, okay, that have their own dispersions, and they occur at different frequencies. Now, if you, well, let me go to this. So what we did is we did essentially this. We took that waveguide and lined it with the material that had a generally anisotropic permittivity and permeability. And then we derived the full dispersion equation. How do you do that? Well, you assume Bessel and Neumann functions in both the vacuum region and the dielectric region. You match boundary conditions, you apply the PEC boundary condition on the outside, and then you obtain this kind of dispersion equation based on Bessel modes, and one of them corresponds to TE-like modes, which we call HE. HE, the letter H stands for hybrid, and that's because you can never get a pure TE mode when your space is filled with two different materials. So you get a hybrid electric mode, hybrid magnetic modes that are akin to the TM modes. And basically, as I mentioned earlier, what we did is we said, let's assume that the permittivity of the liner varies, and how do these cutoff frequencies change? And what we find is that as you approach negative and near zero values of that permittivity, the cutoff frequencies reduce. So what this means is you can operate these waveguides well below their natural cutoffs. If the waveguide were empty, you couldn't do that.
Right.
And I think that would be a brief answer.
Yeah, brief answer. Yeah. So thanks a lot. So I guess I will personally, I will ask one quick question, especially regarding the future scope of the work. Like recently, I was actually following some of the on this use of intelligent reflecting meta surfaces for certain application. Like people are saying that they can be one of the enabling technologies for 6th generation wireless and stuff. So I mean, any comment from you want to share on that?
There's been a lot of development in that area. So intelligent metasurfaces, tunable, what do they call, coding metasurfaces, where we can generate arbitrary patterns, either in reflection or transmission, by engineering the reflection and transmission phase and magnitude of every individual element in the metasurface. I think this has tremendous potential, mainly because it's low profile. You can create arbitrary field transformations. I think it's a major challenge to construct, but over time, that problem will be resolved too. Yeah, I'm actually very excited by that field myself, and it's something that I hope to get into myself.
Okay. So like I'll also like one that offline. I'll request. Yeah. So Dr. Saha and I think his students also have maybe a couple of queries. So Dr. Saha, please, you can take over.
Yeah, I have something to ask, but I'll refrain for the time being. I'll wait for the proper opportunity. So probably the host can take care of the proceedings. We have a little bit formality left.
Okay.
Madhavika?
Yes, sir. Now I would like to invite Ms. Gopika, Chair of IEEE MTT-S SBC IAS Trivandrum, to handle the LFO questions.
Thank you, Malavika. So greetings to all. This LFO Talk series were initiated last year by IEEE Kerala chapter with an aspiration to create a platform for the students to interact with the leaders in the domain. So as a part of the inaugural session of this year's LFO series, we just had Dr. ASHWIN K. Iyer's presentation. Since you have already listened to his technical talk and interacted with him on his research domain, we actually allotted a session for non-technical queries, but due to the time constraints, I am consolidating a few queries from the student community. So, sir, to set the ball rolling, could you please brief about the career perspectives you see for a microwave engineer in post-pandemic scenario? What would be beneficial for a graduate, whether to stay in academia or to switch to industry?
Oh, this is a very good question. And yeah, first I will say that I don't want, I've learned not to draw any distinctions between the quality of a career in academia versus the quality of a career in industry. Both are very necessary in the ecosystem of scientific growth. We need to see applications of technologies in industry. As far as career prospects, I think it varies from region to region. I'll give you an example. At the University of Alberta right now, there are extremely severe budget cuts. And the reason for this is that our economy is essentially based on oil and gas. And whenever there's a downturn in that area, when different governments come into power and they have different priorities, then universities can get affected. So right now at our university, prospects of going into faculty positions, it's low at the moment. But I don't doubt that in a couple of years we will be hiring like crazy. So that's one issue with with academia is that it's extremely seasonal. And it's not often that faculty positions become available. And so I would suggest that that students think very carefully about, you know, whether going into academia is something, and I presume your question refers to after graduation with a PhD, right?
Yes, yes.
Whether they would want to go into academia, because this is a long haul. It's very competitive, and it demands a certain type of personality where you are willing to, you know, put in hours beyond the regular 9 to 5, essentially like being a student, but after your studentship is done. So spending all long hours, your family has to be cooperative. They have to understand that, you know, your job demands these things of you, to work on weekends, to work during the days, to answer questions at night, to put out fires in the lab. You know, so that's one thing I'll say. And also the number of faculty positions that are available is very small. So it's highly competitive. I actually believe that I would say 80% of master's and PhD graduates should consider positions outside of academia. We need to see people who have academic training bringing that mindset to industry. That's important. I actually would rather see trained academics going into industry to change the mindset of industry, to be more forward thinking, to invest in future technologies a little bit more, to partner with academic institutions a little bit more in order to get the technologies that we build as academics into the mainstream.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you. That really was a great insight. And one last question, sir. What would you advise with your immense experience for a what to say, a research invention? Would you go for a patent or a publication? What would you suggest?
Oh, I guess that boils down to personal preference. I'm not very interested in. I mean, it's interesting. It's a very interesting question, because as an academic, you almost have to feel the need to share things with everybody, right? I mean, writing a patent, it goes contrary to that idea, which is you want to keep things for yourself, right? You don't want other people to copy, or you want to commercialize in some way. So you have to decide, do I want to be the kind who wants to share everything with the world, or do I want to be the kind who wants to commercialize it and turn it into a business proposition? They're not mutually exclusive. We have professors who have done both. I have patents that we have names on. I personally prefer publications to patents. But patents have their place also. And in fact, patents have helped me get publications. I'll tell you how. When you patent technology, companies become inherently interested. Once the technology is patented, then they know that it's novel. It must be a new technology because it received a patent. And once you have that patent, companies are willing to license your technology, which means that they were willing to start research collaborations with you. So it actually, patenting leads to publications sometimes.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing time with us. This really was a great
take
session.
a minute, Gopika.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir. Please.
Yeah, so I don't have a technical question, but a few comments. Firstly, once again, thanks to ASHWIN. He mentioned me as one of his close friend. Yeah, and it is definitely reciprocal. And we have been benefited immensely from various technical discussions and some kind of collaborations, at least on a couple of occasions. And at the very beginning, he was mentioning that he doesn't consider himself as L4 speaker, but the type of talk, the type of depth that all of you have seen, and the spectrum of work that he has shown, I know you can definitely consider. He's very humble. That's why he doesn't consider himself as L4, but he's definitely L4 speaker. And I can say he's a future IEEE fellow from Antenna Propagation Society. I mean, for sure, this is my firm belief. And I just want to bring one point through a question to Dr. Iyer regarding his extracurricular activities, because we have spent time on various forums. I know he's a highly cultural person. He appears in All India Radio, maybe not frequently, but quite a few times he has appeared. He has shared some of those discussions with me. He's a quite renowned vocalist, and I have seen his performance in YouTube and other places regarding his Carnatic performance. So my question to ASHWIN is, can you just mention how you manage your time in research, guiding so many students, and also keep your interest on those extracurricular activities and having so nice performance in such podium? Yeah.
Well, thanks for that question, Chinmoy. Yeah, I didn't expect to answer that question, but I'm very happy to. And I think in this context, it's very appropriate. I'm speaking to a group of my Indian colleagues. Despite having been in Canada most of my life, I was fortunate that my parents insisted on a
Can you hear Dr. Iyer?
Yes, there has been a network issue.
Do you see any connectivity issue, as Professor Iyer said?
I can see that it is like it has freezed somehow, like probably some internet issue.
Okay.
All of you can please turn on your video, because in IEEE reporting is also very important, and that would be good if we can have high quality photograph. Malavika, turn on your camera. You volunteers, you can please take screenshot and let us know once it is done. You can take multiple copies. Is it done?
Thank you, sir. It's taken, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
So, Malaga, you may please take over the podium.
Yes. Okay. So thank you, sir. Now I would like to invite Professor Anu Mohammed to share his comments. He is our faculty advisor, IEEE APS and MTT-S SBC GECBH. Okay, sir.
Good evening, good morning to all. First of all, being a part of AP MTT member of this AP MTT Kerala section, we are very much happy to have Dr. Iyer, and that too a morning session starting from 7 o'clock. We are very much obliged to you, sir, for your wonderful talk, and also Siddiqui sir for his presence, and also industrialists and faculties like Devdeep Sarkar sir and other faculties from all over the globe. And let me tell you, from this session, it is very obvious that RF and micro is not everyone's business. It is only through dedication, hard work, and if you have love for that physics, then definitely that spectrum of window, that RF will be open towards you. So I would like to tell the young budding generations uh, to think upon the various applications just our SAR has thrown on you, be it radiating from the radiating aspect, or be it a field incidence problem or a circuit based problem. The way he was showing the various applications right from the beginning, from 2.4 gigahertz to terahertz, it's very, very appealing. And the various application, immense potential applications you see. So I request the young budding generations to look upon this, and I know from among this targeted audience, I think at least a few will make it out, and I am very optimistic regarding that. Thank you all. That's my comment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anu.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now I would like to invite Meher, Chair, MTT-S SBC Government Engineering College, Barton Hill, to deliver the formal vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Chair Engineering Barton Hill, Thiruvananthapuram.
Meher, at my end, you are not audible. Can others hear Meher?
No, not really.
No. Meher, can you try to be louder or check your audio system?
Hello, sir. Am I audible now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon, sir. I am Meher, Chair IEEE MTT-S Engineering Thiruvananthapuram. We say nothing is complete without gratitude. I am extremely happy to deliver the formal words of thanks. Firstly, I thank our speaker, Professor ASHWIN Iyer, for his wonderful section. Sure, all of you are now developments in the field of metamaterials. I'd like to thank Dr. Siddiqui for graduation and for his kind words about Sarkars. Now, I would like to thank our session chair, Dr. Devdeep Sarkars, for chairing the session and handling the Q&A. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Try to be a bit more louder.
Now, thank our pillar of support, founder and chair of IEEE MTT-S Kerala chapter, Dr. Chinmoy Saha. Without his support and mentorship, we won't be able to achieve our goals and dreams. Thank you so much, sir. Next, I thank Sri Ajit Mitra, our mentor and guide, for his support and guidance. Thank you so much, sir. Now, I thank Professor Muhammad, faculty advisor, IEEE APS and MTT-S GECBH, his valuable support and guidance. I thank Ms. Gobika, Ms. Malavika, Mr. Manu, and all the other volunteers behind this event. Yeah. I'd like to thank all our beloved participants for joining with us today. Without your support, this event would not have been successful. Thank you all. Thank you so much, and have a good day. A good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, ASHWIN, once again.
Thank you,
And we'll
Chinmoy.
talk offline.
We'll
Thank
talk
you.
offline. Yes, thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Sure. Bye-bye. You may please close the meeting. You may stop live streaming in YouTube and close the meeting.